Now that we know what chemistry is, we're going to talk about the scientific method. All right, so how do we generate this knowledge that we have about matter? We use what's called the scientific method. And so the scientific method starts with a individual scientist, for example, you, and it would start with you observing something. You see something that is interesting, right? Chemistry is the objects that make up the world around us. And so you could be interested in some of that matter. And so you observe something about the matter around you and you form a question about that, right? You see something interesting. You see water do something or something dissolved in water. What's going on there? From that, you form a question. The first thing you actually do is you try to make a guess. You form a hypothesis. And you try to explain the answer to your question. And the reason why you do that is it gives you something to test. It makes something that is verifiable to test. It's hard to answer a question, but if you propose an idea, it's easier to test that idea, that response to the question. So you form a hypothesis. That's the first thing that you do to start it off. And then you perform an experiment to test that hypothesis. You need to, answering a question via an experiment is a little more open-ended, but by having an answer, you can either verify or disprove that answer that you proposed. And so when you perform an experiment, you do a real-life test. You really do test the actual matter around you, and that generates what's called a fact. And a fact is something that reflects reality. The result of one experiment generates a fact. This is something that really is true. Okay, so each individual scientist will undergo this process in terms of generating new information. It starts with observing something interesting and forming a question and then trying to answer that question. So that's each individual person. How does that become overall scientific knowledge? Well, what happens is a lot of people do a lot of experiments about kind of similar things. So each one experiment generates a fact. A collection of similar experiments generate what's called a law. So a scientific law is a summary of experimental results. So we've done a bunch of experiments and we've always gotten the same type of result. Then we call that a law. One of the purposes of a scientific law is to prevent other people from having to do that same experiment. We've done these experiments consistently. Water is always wet. So the law can just be that water is wet, or that we don't need to do, other people don't need to do that experiment. That is a scientific law that just exists. It's a summary of what has happened in experiments. After you do enough of those experiments and generate that law, you maybe want to have, that kind of is corresponding to your fact. The corresponded version of like a better hypothesis is called a scientific theory. So this would be a hypothesis that's been tested many times and has been appropriately kind of tested and vetted and seen to be accurate. You cannot prove a scientific theory. You can only prove laws. Scientific theories are explanations for scientific laws. We test them and we try to get new information from them, but we can't ever prove them. And that's okay. They're doing something different. They're explaining a scientific law, which is just experimental results. Right? So you're trying to explain experimental results. And so what that theory allows you to do, the reason why theories are useful is they let you make predictions, right? If you can understand why something happens, then that allows you to form new questions. And then rinse, repeat, the cycle just keeps going. You have new questions, you make new guesses, you make new experiments. So the cycle perpetuates itself and we keep learning new things about the world around us. So if we want to think about this in kind of context, something that your observation, when I drop something, it falls to Earth. Okay, so that's something you can observe. Hypothesis. There is some force called gravity that causes objects to fall towards Earth. Experiment. I dropped dozens of objects and tested how they fell towards Earth. Law. Based on all my experiments, you could have come up with the law of gravity, right? But what you can do is the idea, you keep dropping it long enough, you drop enough objects, you see how they fall towards Earth, you can verify that gravity exists. So the reason why gravity is a law is because people have dropped thousands, millions of objects and they keep falling. And so that's our law of gravity. Specifically, there are ways that we can measure those things and measure how strongly things fall. And that's where the numerical version of the law of gravity comes from. Something like this. You know, you can get an equation. And you'll note we have a thing that's called a constant in there, this capital G. And one of the things you'll note is the law just tells me what this number is. It doesn't tell me where that number comes from or why it exists. Just that this number, if I plug in a specific number for G, I can understand the force of gravity. If I know the masses of the objects and I know how far apart they are. And we can do this and we can figure out how planets move and we can predict orbits, but we have no idea where that G number comes from or why. We know it comes from because we just did a bunch of experiments and saw their results. But we don't know why that number is what it is. Just this is the number we use. This number works. Let's keep using it. So in order to understand why, that's where your theory comes in. So you can have, we're not going to go into it, but basically that's where relativity or special relativity, the work of Albert Einstein, comes in, that we have this idea of relativity, that gravity exists because objects bend space toward themselves, causing distortions in space-time. Okay, all sorts of complicated things that I can't explain, but what it does is it allows you to make predictions, because now you can start to make predictions about how things like light are affected by gravity, because they exist in space, they can move around, and that gives you insights into why G, that capital G value, is what it is. And so you can start doing these like crazy experiments where you look at like how light gets shifted around objects like the sun, and you can make predictions and you can observe things like the effects of black holes and all these crazy experiments that we can do now that come from that theory. And we can start to then kind of move forward with that knowledge. Now, we can never prove that space-time is bending, but we can say, well, if space-time bends, we could test some things. We can test, does light bend around the sun? And then when we test it and we see, yeah, light does bend around the sun. It doesn't mean our theory is correct, but importantly, it means our theory isn't wrong. And that's why it's called a theory. It's not just a hypothesis. It's been tested, and it's been tested and vetted. It has never been proven, but it's never been proven wrong. It's never been bad. So for our course, chemistry, we'll get back into the world of chemistry, everything that we're going to talk about comes from the scientific method, which means it reflects an observation of the real world that has been tested and vetted. What we're going to learn about are laws and theories. We're not going to be talking about hypotheses or anything like that. But one of the things that's important to note is chemistry is relatively young as far as science goes. Most chemical knowledge doesn't really start to come up until the 1800s. Lavoisier is like the father of modern chemistry. He's active around that time. Really kind of formalized the ideas. And most of what we know as modern chemistry is about 75, maybe 90 years old at this point in time. Maybe more like 100. But the thing is, we're still learning a lot about chemistry. We're still learning a lot about what goes on and at this level of what really makes up all of this matter. And so this is really still a very vibrant and changing field. And relatively young. You know, physics is hundreds of years older. Biology is way older because we've been able to see living things for a long time. So when we look at this class, you know, the whole point of having lecture and kind of paired with lab is the idea that you're learning chemical theory and then seeing it performed in the lab. And now, in our case, when we're doing experiments in the lab or watching experiments performed or thinking about these things, they do have a desired ending, right? There is a goal. This is known. We're not just kind of totally blindly exploring. These things are meant to be educational. But when you're thinking through experiments, when you're reading lab handouts, doing the pre-labs, thinking about working through the post-labs, writing conclusions, the whole idea is we're getting practice forming hypotheses and making observations based on those hypotheses, right? Pulling those things together. That's why we have these structures. There also is like technique and all sorts of other things like that. But a lot of it is the idea of taking the theoretical, the conceptual ideas, and really seeing it in action. And one of the things I want, the most important thing is that I want you to be thinking, asking questions is the most important part of being a scientist. Being curious about things is the starting point for all knowledge that has ever been gained. People don't just realize things without wanting to know something. A lot of times you don't learn what you initially thought you wanted to know, but you can learn new things just by being curious. So if you ever have any questions about any of the content, I'm always more than happy to talk about them, because that's a sign that you're being a good scientist, right? You want to be exploring, asking new and more questions. All right, just getting into a bit more meat of the content. No participations for this one, but we do want to be prepared for that Module 1 homework due Wednesday. See you in the next video.